He's got the whole world in his hand. He's got the whole wide world in his hand. He's got the whole world in his hand. He's got the whole world in his hand. Well, when Shishin Roshi asked me to give a talk on the third of the breakthrough koans in this series, The Sound of One Hand, I immediately thought of this traditional American spiritual tune, as came to mind as essentially pointing to the same thing. Of course, in Zen, we'd express it differently. We'd say the whole world is his hand. And of course, then there's no him. And well, actually, the truth about this koan is there's no hand and there's no sound either. And when I looked up this tune, I realized I'd remembered it as the whole world being in his hand. And actually it's hands, and we've only got one hand. But other than that, it's exactly the same, right? Okay. I do think it points to the same point in a certain way. We just have a little less separation in the way we look at it. So the sound of one hand, probably the most famous koan. If you look up koans on the internet, it will no doubt come right up. And it's often misstated as what is the sound of one hand clapping, which isn't actually the koan. The way it was originally stated by Hakuin, who I'll talk more about in a minute, was we know the sound of two hands coming together or two hands clapping. What is the sound of one hand? So it's just what is the sound of one hand? And when we call it the sound of one hand clapping, that's liable to lead to clever responses to it, such as this. People often do that when you say the sound of one hand clapping, right? And that's one of those answers that well, Shishin Roshi would always, if I gave an answer anything like that, he'd always say clever. And when I first started working with Shishin Roshi, I used to ask him, do you mean good clever or bad clever? I came after a very short time to realize clever is always bad clever, right? You don't want clever answers. It's not about clever answers. It's not like some kind of a Western riddle. It's much deeper than that. So just like mu is, and just like who am I? These are very deep and serious questions. Strangely, the sound of one hand is maybe the only koan, or certainly one of the few, and that's traditionally used, that it comes from a fairly recent source. I don't know about who. I was asking Shishin Roshi about that this morning, and that's a more recent use too. I think it came out of the Robert Aitken and Kapleau lineages. But as far as a koan that sounds more like a traditional koan, kind of the only recent or contemporary one is the sound of one hand. And I can imagine some of you saying recent, contemporary, didn't that come from Hakuin? Well, yes, it came from Hakuin. And Hakuin Ekaku is worth talking about a little bit. He's one of our important dharma ancestors. But in Buddhist terms, he's relatively recent. He was an 18th century Japanese Zen master who's known for revitalizing the koan system. And in fact, all of Rinzai Zen at a time when it had gone rather dead. So the koan system that we use now is derived largely from Hakuin's system that he built, well, not long before the American Revolution. Hakuin died in 1769, just 7 years before the American Revolution. If he'd been able to travel to America, he could have visited the 13 colonies. That's how recent it is. And that may not seem recent, but to put it in context, the golden age of Zen began in China more than 1,000 years before the time of Hakuin, and it ended about 800 years before the time of Hakuin. And the golden age of Zen itself was more than 1,000 years after the time of the Buddha. So Hakuin was a lot closer to us than a lot of the masters whose names we know from the koans, a lot closer to us in time than the historical Buddha. And when I looked into that, when I started looking into the numbers, it kind of blew me away. You know, 1,000 years before Hakuin, here's the golden age of Zen in Tang Dynasty China, flowering in this pretty incredible civilization, while Europe was entering the Dark Ages, being overrun by barbarians. The new world had not yet been, quote, discovered yet, although I think there were some people who knew it was here. Anyway, it's, and here we are still practicing it. Isn't that kind of amazing? You know, that Zen sprang up more than 1,000 years after the time of the Buddha as a return to Asian practice, to direct experience, at a time when Buddhism had become kind of reduced to ritual and building of monuments and that sort of thing. And then 1,000 years later, it needs another revitalization. Along comes Hakuin to do that. So, and maybe we're all kind of revitalizing it a little bit now. In fact, we are. I've known Japanese priests who've come over here to practice with some of our teachers because they feel that that Buddhism had gotten a little stale in Japan. So, so a little bit more about Hakuin. So Hakuin was born in the late 1600s, and as a child, he made the mistake, or maybe it wasn't a mistake, of and Zen give a talk about not Pure Land Zen, Pure Land Buddhism. Pure Land's not Zen. He went to hear a talk from a Nichiren sect Pure Land teacher, and the talk really reminded me of Shinko Roshi's readings recently from her book, because as it turned out, this talk was about the 8 Buddhist hells, the fiery, burning Buddhist hells. And I don't know why this Pure Land or what priest was warning against these hells. In Zen, we regard them as largely mythic, but it terrified Hakuin, just like Shinko Roshi expressed as a child, being terrified of the fires of hell. I just think, what do we do to these kids? Oh my God, you know? So Hakuin was so terrified by the fires of hell and by the notions that he might fall into them if he did the wrong thing, that he thought, I better become a priest. So anyway, so as a teenager, he went to ordain as a priest, and he wisely avoided the Nichiren Pure Land sect. He didn't want to hear any more about hell. He signed on as a Zen priest, and he practiced really fiercely. He practiced so fiercely that there's different accounts. What I was just looking up when we started was I was trying to find out the number of satoris that Hakuin claimed. I've run across it before, but I couldn't find the exact number. Let's just say he claimed to have experienced dozens of satoris, big satoris, and small satoris, not too many to count. That's Hakuin for you. But he practiced so fiercely that he actually gave himself what he called Zen sickness, and probably now we'd call a breakdown. For a couple of years, he was really unbalanced and ill as a young man. So just a little more about Hakuin. He went on to become really, some people say, the most influential Zen master of the last 500 years. He formed a community of hundreds of monks. He left 80 dharma successors, 80 dharma successors, wow. Some of his principles, he traveled all over the country as well, speaking on Zen and encouraging people to meditate. One of his main points was that he felt enlightenment or wisdom, compassion. The truth was open to all, to anyone who seriously took on the path. But he felt that the highest value of practice was practice after awakening. So when we're dealing with these breakthrough koans, we've spoken about Mu, we've spoken about who am I, and now the sound of one hand. These are meant to provoke an initial experience of seeing our true nature. And yet, inevitably, we see that, and then we have a lot more practice to do to be able to integrate what we've seen, if we see it. Hakuin invented his own koan, basically, the sound of one hand, because he felt it was very important to stimulate the great doubt. And Mui talked about great faith in his talk. And the three traditional pillars of Zen are great faith, great doubt, and great determination. Great doubt being not the doubt where you wonder whether you're good enough, or not the doubt whether you wonder whether, the Dharma is a valid path. It's the kind of doubt where you doubt all of life and you really need to know. You really want to come to grips with what life's about. And of course, all of the breakthrough koans are versions of the same question. Who am I really? What's this life about? If I got to the bottom of my experience, what would I find? Something like that. So I looked in a little bit to why Hakuin came up with one hand to stimulate the great doubt. Because these breakthrough koans were meant to be a method to do that, to really bring that great doubt to a point, at least in the Rinzai sect and in the koan system. It's meant to bring that great doubt to kind of this boiling point to where it bursts open and we have this breakthrough experience. It doesn't happen for everyone like that, maybe needless to say. I'll talk about that a little bit. But first I looked into why Hakuin felt he had to invent his own method. And sorry, Mui, but it seems like it was because he didn't like Mu. He didn't like using the koan Mu. And he later said that to sit with the sound of one hand was so far superior to any earlier methods of stimulating the great doubt that it was like clouds compared to mud. So, so a little bit about what these koans do and how they're supposed to work. If you look up one hand on the internet, you'll find koans described as a kind of a riddle that's meant to kind of throw a wrench into the works of the rational mind and bind up the rational mind so that we have to find a way to go deeper than the rational mind to come up with a response to them. And that's got some truth in it, but it's interesting. I found a quote by Ruth Fuller Sasaki, who, interestingly enough, I believe that she was the first Westerner to become a Rinzai priest in Japan in the might have been late 40s or early 1950s. And she eventually became abbot of a temple there. And interestingly enough, Jiu Kennet in the 50s also became one of the first Western women to become a ordained priest and abbot of a Soto temple. So some of our first Western Zen ancestors were women and who broke those barriers. And it's interesting that even back then, the 40s and 50s, the Japanese teachers, they just didn't know how to handle Western women. Of course, I don't either. None of us do. But they kind of gave them, well, both Ruth Fuller Sasaki and G.U. Kennett were given a really hard time. But they weren't relegated to the nuns' quarters. They were eventually treated more or less like equals, and they both became abbots of their temples. So Ruth Fuller Sasaki says this about koans. She says they're not paradoxical. She says a koan is a simple and clear statement made from the state of consciousness it has helped to awaken. Made from the state of consciousness it has helped to awaken. So isn't that interesting? She said that it may operate beyond rational thought, and they do operate beyond rational thought, but it includes rational thought. It doesn't exclude rational thought. It's just bigger than that. And if we enter the right state of mind, it will be perfectly clear how to present a koan. And there's definitely a lot of truth to that, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But first, so we've got these three choices that we use as initial koans. Usually these are the first koans given, or some version of these. The koan mu, of course, comes from an encounter between a monk and Joshu, where the monk asks Joshu, the master Joshu, does a dog have Buddha nature? And Joshu says mu, which means literally no. And all of that really is window dressing, because when we sit with the koan mu, we just sit with mu as mui so moofully mooed a couple of days ago. We just sit with mu. Mu becomes like an enormous eraser that wipes out conceptual thought, wipes out anything we think our true nature might be. It doesn't have anything to do with the dog, really. When we approach it in this way, it doesn't have anything to do with Joshu or the monk. It doesn't have anything to do with yes or no, because as Mui said, there's another version of the koan in which the monk asks Joshu, and Joshu says yes. And, you know, koans are tricky. It has nothing to do with yes or no. It has nothing to do with dualistic responses. When I was looking up the origins to find out more about how people approach one hand and how people use it these days, in this lineage, we usually use mu or hu as a beginning koan, but the sound of one hand is often used, and that's what Hakuin used. But when I looked up what other people had to say about it, I found some odd stuff. One teacher was pointing to the symbolism of two hands clapping versus one hand and saying, well, it's obviously symbolic of two hands coming together is dualistic. One hand is just about unity. And I think there's some truth in that. There's a symbolic level to these koans, but that's not going to help you when you go into the Dokusan room and you try and present it, right? And then he went on to suggest that possible presentations might be to actually clap your two hands together, because the two hands are really one hand, so you might as well just clap them together, and that's a way to present it. Personally, I thought that's a lousy answer. Certainly, it's not going to go over with our Roshis, I don't think. In fact, I might have even tried it at one point. I don't know. Anyway, and then you get that response that we all hate, which is that doesn't reach it. You know, that's right. He also suggested that you could just shout, "What?" And I don't think that would go over either. No, it's really, these are all just surface scrapings. What we really have to do is allow mu or hu or one hand to permeate our entire being. We have to become the koan. That's always the instruction, right? To become the koan. when we become the koan, it's true. It's very clear how to present it. If we actually become one hand, we will know how to present the koan. But in thinking these over, I first worked on Mu, which I'll tell you the torment of that in a few minutes. Because the first koan tends to be the most difficult for most of us. But they have different qualities to them. The Mu, I think, is a great first koan to work on if you're in a session, if you're in a retreat setting, because you can just give your whole attention to it and use it like that eraser to just wipe out everything. And you don't have to think when you're in retreat, really. You know, especially if you're in residence, you follow the schedule, you just go along, everything's laid out for you. But it's so nebulous and ungraspable. I mean, where'd the dog go? Where'd Joshu go? Where'd yes and no go? What's going on here? I'm just sitting with Mu, what? One hand initially seems more graspable, but at least, there's a hand there, right? But actually there's no hand, there's no sound. It doesn't have to do with the hand or with the sound any more than Mu has to do with the dog. We become the koan. It goes beyond all of that. So you could boil all the koans, all the breakthrough koans down to, as I said before, who am I really? Or maybe, where is my true self to be found? Where would I look for my true self? Of course, there's only one place to look for our true self. It's closer than we can imagine. And again, to go back to the biblical references like the whole world in his hand, the kingdom of God is to be found within. Isn't that in the Bible? And Dogen calls it taking the backward step. We look within to find this answer. We're not going to find it externally. We're not going to find it in the dog. We're not going to find it in a hand. We're not going to find it in sound. We have to completely become the koan through and through. So those answers like shouting what, or bringing the hands together, or this, that's just one hand claptrap. We need to go deeper than that, right? We need to go deeper than clever. So one thing that can get in the way of our being able to work with koans is that we can get all hung up in this dramatic talk of kensho and seeing our true nature and summoning great doubt. And some accounts say great doubt is like a red hot iron ball lodged in the throat. And well, for one thing, that doesn't sound like something we want to do, does it, in the West? It's like, no, I mean, there's good sitcoms to watch and other stuff. We can go shopping. Who wants the red hot iron ball in the throat? There are certain personalities that are driven like that, real type A, personality. I have to know the truth or I will die. Yeah, that's the kind of person who puts the plank over the well, right? And sits on the plank, and they're either going to break through their koan, or they're going to, fall off the plank and die, But I don't know about you all. It was never exactly like that for me. I definitely came to practice out of desperation because I was having these very serious health issues. I'd always been interested, but like a lot of us, it's not until you face some sort of crisis that you really are driven to take up practice seriously. But that was in the beginning days of my practice, and doing sessions and practicing deeply had actually helped put those health problems into remission, kind of on the back burner for a while. So by the time I took up the koan Mu, I was a lot more relaxed. I'm an easygoing fella, and so I wasn't that driven. It definitely, I don't think I approached the koan with great doubt. At that time, I was practicing with Daido Roshi and at Zen Mountain Monastery in upstate New York. And I was living on the East Coast for a time. I was just going up there for a session, and then I went up and did a 6-week residency. And I didn't know Daido well at the time. And I'd been practicing at Zen Center of Los Angeles, which had, at that time, a fairly laid back attitude. I mean, with Maizumi Roshi, one time when my back was hurting, I was in Dokusan, and he said, "Oh, practice is not asceticism. Turn around and I'll give you a back rub." And he actually gave me a back rub. So it wasn't a real fierce style of practice at that time. But when I got to Zen Mountain, Daido had a really imposing kind of Dokusan style. You had to go through all the usual. We don't go through so much ritual to get to the meeting with the teacher now, but then there was a whole series of bows, and then you end up in the Dokusan room, and it's dark, and there's incense burning in just one candle, and this big man is sitting there in the dark with his bald head, and he had navy tattoos, and in the dark they seemed to be crawling around his arm, and he's holding a kiyosaku, a stick, and he just would glare at you and say, "Well, do you have anything to say?" It really wasn't my style of approaching koans, but I was pretty intimidated, in fact. But nonetheless, during that period of, maybe it was 6 months, I was sitting in session, and I did. It wasn't, I didn't have a great breakthrough experience. It was more like a little aha moment. Oh, I know what mu is. And so I went into the Dokusan room and I presented it to Daido. And Daido said, "Too intellectual." And I didn't understand that what he was telling me was my presentation was too intellectual. I thought he was telling me I was just way off base. So I proceeded to spend another maybe a year getting further and further from myself. And the only place to find a response to mu or one hand or hu is here. I just got further and further afield and more frustrated. And finally, I just got pissed off and gave up working on mu and just went back to just sitting practice Shikantaza. So 12 years passed. And I was one of these people who's very slow to take jukai, to take the precepts. In the meantime, I'd spent quite a lot of time at the monastery, and Shikantaza worked pretty well for me. And because I was taking my degree at Naropa at the time, I was able to get myself assigned when Daido came to Naropa as his student assistant, and that stern Zen master thing had broken down, and I'd gotten to know him, very well, we became very close, and he became a close mentor figure. We really became friends. So that whole stern Zen master thing in Dokusan kind of dropped off, and I was able to get around it more, but I still didn't want to go back to mu. So finally, by the time I wanted to do jukai, take the precepts, they'd set up at the monastery you had 2 years of hoops to jump through with doing various things and study of the precepts and this and that. So I started practicing with Maizumi Roshi in 1987, I think. And it was the year 2001, on April Fool's Day, fittingly enough, that I finally found myself in a jukai ceremony at the monastery with 11 other people taking jukai with Daido. And I was sitting there, and, as all the chanting's going on and the bowing and all the stuff we do with jukai, and all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, I gave the right answer 12 years ago. I just gave it the wrong way, and, but I didn't get a chance to talk to Daido after that, because we were just leaving the monastery. Tanya and I were there for, I think, 10 weeks or something. We'd been in near residence there. We were across the street, and we'd rented an apartment, and we had to leave. So I didn't get to present that to Daido. I actually presented it to Shishin Roshi, and it turned out that it was the right presentation. I later presented it to Daido, it was the right presentation. But so I didn't have a giant breakthrough or giant kensho or anything like that. It was more 2 aha experiences 12 years apart, So the reason I share this is because we can make too much of thinking we're going to have a breakthrough, or thinking we should have a breakthrough, or thinking that we should have kensho. The truth is, not everybody is going to have kensho, but everybody, in my experience, who takes on this practice seriously will experience a growth in wisdom and compassion and a transformation in their being. As Yugen demonstrated yesterday, having claimed for years to be at the extreme end of the introvert scale, yesterday, what does he do? A whole song and dance routine for us. Where's this introvert gone? Now, of course, we all may occasionally run into that person who we think, oh my God, you've been practicing for how many years and you're still like that? But, you know, whenever I ask Shishin Roshi about that, he always says, you should have seen that person before they started practicing, right? So we'll all experience this transformation. I actually spent some time with Suzuki Roshi's son, Hoitsu Suzuki, on 3 different occasions. He came out to do first 2 ceremonies, groundbreaking, and then mountain seat, and then he led a sesshin at Dragon Mountain Zen Temple in Crestone for my friend Steve Allen, who's the abbot there. Tanya and I went up 3 times and spent time with Hoitsu and got to know him fairly well. The last time Hoitsu came, he came with his wife and 4 monks from Eheiji, because by then Hoitsu was the Tanto at Eheiji, which is a big deal. That's Dogen's monastery, and he was the Tanto is like the practice master, right? So, and also Hoitsu is actually the one who transmitted to most of the San Francisco Zen Center teachers, because after they had the blow up with Richard Baker, who had the transmission from Suzuki Roshi, Richard Baker left, and Hoitsu came over to perform those transmission ceremonies. So, and Hoitsu's an amazing man, obviously brimming over with compassion, insight, wisdom. And well, on a little aside, his wife came over with him to do the session, and 4 monks from Eheiji, week-long session at Steve Allen's place. His wife came over because she came over to do session for the first time in her life. She, back in Japan, was kind of relegated to the temple wife position, and it just wasn't done for her to do session. She had to sneak across the Pacific, drive all the way up from Albuquerque to Crestone, and you should have seen those Eheiji young monks' eyes. They were like saucers. They'd never seen so much open country. Driving up from Albuquerque to Crestone, I don't think they knew there was so much open country in the world. And she, so she was so eager for that session. She must have been in her 50s and had never sat session. She sat much better than any of the 4 clean-cut, you know, just so Eheiji monks in their robes. So who were all nodding out from jet lag. She just sat like a rock. She was radiant after. But also another aside, before going up for that session, Steve calls me up and says, be sure to bring your guitar. And I say, why? He says, well, at the end of session, we'll have some kind of little celebration, and Hoitsu loves Western rock and roll and folk music. So I said, okay, we'll bring up my guitar. But anyway, before we got to the music, there was the session. And in that kind of Soto school, they tend to do only 1 Dokusan in a week. And so I talked to Hoitsu informally a fair amount, but I only had this 1 chance to do Dokusan with him. So I thought, you know what, I'm gonna go for broke. In the middle of the session, I'm having this audience with him, and I just thought, he's the Tanto at Eheiji, you know, he's a deeply realized man, obviously deeply compassionate, full of wisdom. I'm just going to go for broke and talk really frankly to him about certain experiences I'd had in practice. And as I recall, I told him about 1 or 2 opening experiences I had, not from working on the koans. I actually never had a big experience working on the koans, but I just thought, okay, Yugen was talking about vulnerability yesterday. It felt really vulnerable, you know. Here's this, you know, top-notch Zen master, and make myself vulnerable and just talk about really what's happened to me in practice. And to my amazement, at the end of me telling him a story or two about things that happened to me in practice, he looked at me and very frankly, he said, nothing like that's never happened to me. I've never had a kensho. I just thought, what? Amazing, you know? He's never had a kensho. It just really showed me, and since then I've talked to a lot of teachers about kensho, and obviously if one has a kensho, it's a marvelous, marvelous, wondrous thing. Nonetheless, I don't, you know, not everybody's going to have them. And if we start making that the point of practice, it's just going to bind us up. We just have to be who we are, practice, and know the practice, whether in dramatic moments or whether just slowly, as Dogen says, if you walk in the mist, you get wet. For some people, it happens that way. For all of us, it happens that way. So you have a few dramatic experiences like Hakuin, you know, we may just fall back into confusion, but then there's this slow absorption that happens where gradually things change and we don't even notice them changing. So I often think that's the most important. But I think it's important that we know that, because it can get so much in our way that we're supposed to have some kind of something happen, right? Many people can go all the way through the koan system and never have a giant breakthrough experience, and that's okay. They wouldn't get through the koan system if they weren't growing in wisdom, right? But just an end to the Huetsu story. Well, we did end up singing, and Huetsu did love American music, and we sang Beatles and we sang Bob Dylan, and he knew all the songs, and he especially loved the one song he loved, and he just spelt it out as the House of the Rising Sun. And so when that was all over and I was walking out with my guitar, Tanya was walking up beside me, she leaned over and she said, do you just realize that you coerced the tanto of the Heiji into singing a song about a brothel? Which is what the House of the Rising Sun is about, which we both found pretty amusing. I hadn't quite thought about the lyrics at the time. Of course, then we wondered, Japan's called the land of the rising sun. So for who knows how they were taking it. Maybe they were thinking of it as a song about Japan, that we were paying homage to Japan. But anyway, these cultural crossovers. But another funny thing happened before we left, which is the last thing that happened before I was packing up my guitar. These 4 months from Eiheiji, the main thing I remember about them, you know, they weren't supposed to wash or shave their heads during session. That's, you know, you're supposed to, like, you know, get gritty, right? But still, they were Eiheiji monks and they had something to uphold, and they were in the bathroom every night, not only shaving their heads, but so if you didn't see that, you'd think miraculously they just don't grow any hair during session. But they're also always washing their underwear by hand. I wonder, why were they doing, they're all 4 months and they're just talking Japanese, washing their underwear. Just thinking, did they only bring one pair? I mean, what was, or did they have 2 pairs where they cycle? This is a koan I never solved. I didn't know what they were doing because they couldn't speak English really. But anyway, at the end of the night of singing, before I packed the guitar up, one of the monks just gestures, can you borrow my guitar? I'm like, sure, you know, what's this Japanese monk gonna do with this guitar? I don't know. I gave him my guitar. To my amazement, he begins playing this blues progression and starts belting out in perfect American English the lyrics to a Robert Johnson blues song, Sweet Home Chicago, just like as though he was fluent in English, you know. And then he hands the guitar back to me, and I just had to think, boy, they don't make monks like they used to, you know. So anyway, long way around it is, let's not get too hung up. Let's not get hung up on the hand. Let's not get hung up on the sound. Let's not get hung up on the dog. Let's not get hung up on no. Let's not get hung up on yes. Let's not get hung up on kensho. Let's not get hung up on great doubt. let's, when I finally got back to working on Mu, Daido and Shishin both encouraged me to just do it my way. I didn't have to raise great doubt. I remember Daido saying, you know, that's just not your personality. You're an easygoing guy. Work on it easygoing. It's just like, woo, woo, woo. So, you know, I still got bored with it and stopped, and the 12 years passed. But anyway, you know, to see our true nature in practice, there's something I say to students I work with a lot, and I hope it's true, which is that we all have our own template for liberation within us. It doesn't look like anyone else's template. And our job as teachers or guides in the Dharma are to help others uncover their own path and not to follow. How could they follow along the way we've gone? You know, it's a creative act. Practice is a creative act. We know, yeah, we say there's no good and no bad practice, and there's no good days of meditation, no bad days. And yet sometimes there are bad days, months, years. Sometimes we get really stuck, you know? And if we're fortunate at times like that, we find a way to make practice our own and find our own creative way through it. Like Yugen said yesterday, it's not about getting anything. If anything, it's about giving up. It's about letting go of the things that are in the way of our true nature. It's not that we have to grasp our true nature. We're sitting on top of it. Yasutani Roshi, I've been reading his commentaries on the Genjo Koan, Dogen's Genjo Koan, and he quotes Dogen as saying that your true nature is right underfoot. And then Yasutani goes on to say it's more than just underfoot. It is the foot. So we could say it is the hand, right? It is the hand. It's closer than we can imagine. So what we can't make our true nature reveal itself to us. What we hope to do through practice is to take away the things that are in the way of us seeing our true nature. And this is what we call the ego, which was not a Buddhist term. It's a Western psychological term, but for our purposes, we could regard what we call ego, the part that's in the way, as a system of defenses and as a story of who we are. And defenses like judgment, resistance, preferences, opinions, pride, taking offense, taking things personally, you know, all these, we kind of know the list. We hear it again and again, one way or another. These are the things that are in the way. So Mu, or one hand, is like that eraser that we can use to erase our self-story, at least for a time. We can use maybe to erase our factors of mind, like judgment, pride, defensiveness, things like that that are getting in the way. So in closing, where do we expect? We all know that the only true moment, our life is only happening here in this moment. This is the only true place our life happens, right? We're spending our whole lives together now. The past used to be real, but it's not real anymore. The future might never become real. Even if we get enlightened 20 years from now, what time will it be when it happens? It'll be now. It'll be a different now, it'll be a later now, but it'll be a now, won't it? It only ever happens now. Isn't that weird that no matter how far we sail out on this sea of time, we're always in this little boat called now, right? We're always nowing. So we often think that we're going to somehow find it later. But as Shinko Roshi is fond of saying, there's no such thing. We're not living in linear time. Linear time exists relatively, but we're always now, right? So we hear practice, we hear our true nature described as the unborn and the undying. Well, from the standpoint of now, where is our birth? Are we being born now? Are we dying this second? Relatively speaking, of course, we have to keep death in mind. Relatively speaking, we know we were born. We're always being told to keep death in mind to make us practice. But now, where are we going to find the unborn and undying if it's not happening now? Right? When I have my little, when I'm, you know how they write on the sterns of boats the names, the Adriatic, the Drunken Pelican, the Aunt Martha. I want my boat to just be titled The Now, you know, and, you know, full steam ahead, ahoy, looking for the farthest shore. Nope, let's not get caught there either, right? Because we're only going to find it on the boat of the present moment, right? So if we're going to find our true nature in some now, why not just see it now? Why not put all our efforts into finding it now? Isn't the unborn and the undying, the only place for it to happen is now. The only place for our true self to be is right here. The only thing we're risking is our ego. We risk looking foolish, becoming vulnerable. None of us have to worry about any of that after seeing You Can Do a Song and Dance number yesterday, right? You know, all we have to do is be willing to reveal ourselves. So this one hand isn't bound by anything. It pervades the entire universe. It's huge. It's big, and so are we. We're bigger than we can imagine. It's closer than we can imagine. It's not bound by sound. It's not bound by anatomy. Dogen says that we can hear sound with the eye and we can see with the ear. So let's not get trapped in just the ear. Let's not get trapped in just the hand. Because the whole world is this hand, the whole wide world is this hand, the universe is this hand, and you are this hand. And thank you all for listening.